everyone, to this month's Jyotish Journey webinar associated with the article Dangerous Liaisons. You know, you've all heard me joke that my friends call me the rosy astrologer because mostly I focus on very happy topics and favorable events. But, of course, the reality in life is that obviously people go through very difficult periods that can bring a major health crisis. And this is, of course, what this article is about. So do people remember, or who can articulate, what are the two types of periods and subperiods in particular that I was highlighting in the article that sometimes, not always, sometimes can, be very challenging in terms of health? What would those be? Anyone?
Marak, functional Marak, and Trishadya, house lord.
Well, that was mentioned in the article. In other words, the primary Maraka, right? Primary Marakas being planets in or ruling the second or the seventh house. And at the end of the article, I did talk about Trishadya Lord periods and subperiods that way. That wasn't the main thrust of the article, though. What was the main thrust of the article?
Trick lords, Mark, lords of the 6th, 8th, specifically,
right.
And 12th
so,
time.
Trick house lords, right? Of course, there's some overlap there. The 6 is both a Trishadya Lord and also a trick house lord, right? So you've got major periods of primary Marakas, sub-periods of trick house lords, or major periods of trick house lords, sub-periods of Maraka. But then what did I mention? If this is likely to bring a health crisis, what would you normally want to additionally see? Not want to, but would additionally see. Right? What would you additionally see with regards to those two categories of planets?
Additional malefic influence.
Additional influence of natural malefic and or malefic house lords, right? Bad placements can contribute to this as well, right? But, I decided to write this article because I've just seen so many instances where this was actually the case that, we as astrologers should be aware that such periods can give this kind of result, and, potentially forewarned is forearmed, as I mentioned at the end of the article, right? But then, also in the article, I mentioned the periods and subperiods of just two primary Marakas, right? Again, more likely to cause a problem if they have additional affliction. Now, let's be clear. A person can be running Maraka periods and never so much as catch a cold, right? So you don't want to always see them as being, so nefarious this way. But of course, they're only going to bring a person's passing when a person's ayus, their longevity is up. But no question that they can, in certain contexts, certain instances, bring, Ken Rao used to use the really helpful term death-like suffering. You won't die during this period, but you'll have death-like suffering, something that I always said, oh my God, what a thing to say. So, these are the periods that you can be sort of on the lookout for, right? And I'm going to start out by sharing my screen here. And people can please let me know when they're seeing a chart.
Now we can see it.
Right. So Joseph McCarthy is not a name I would expect most people to recognize. He was I would say he was famous, but he was also became rather infamous. He was he held a high political position. He was the senator, a Republican senator from the state of Wisconsin here in the U.S. And but he became notorious for being, this was at the height of the Cold Wars when he was serving in the Senate. And there was a lot of paranoia about the infiltration of communist individuals or communist spies or subversive individuals into the U.S. government, into the U.S. military, in the universities in the U.S., in the film industry. This became kind of like a real witch hunt that he was sort of the spearhead of. But as a result, he became, a very, very visible person in the media. He actually ruined a lot of people's lives because most of his accusations were baseless and they were unfounded. There was no evidence to that effect, but, people were smeared. as a result of this. So this is the individual that you're looking at. And you can see if you look down at the Vimshotri Dasha, that at age 23, he entered his Venus major period. And this is the period, actually it was the period, Venus-Saturn, period and sub-period of Venus-Saturn, that he became a U.S. senator. So in other words, it gave him a position. How and what by what, you know, some of you who take individual tutoring from me may have seen this example already, so I'd have you actually sort of hang back as I ask others here. But by what principles of Jyotish could this Venus elevate him, give him Raja Yoga-like effects, give him a pretty high status position? Does anybody see
From
anything?
Venus, from
Sorry?
Venus, from Venus, Mahadasha, Venus becomes the second and ninth lord. So it
Well,
gives
from Dasha Lagna, it
Dasha
becomes
Lagna,
this,
yes.
right? But you know that doesn't by itself form any yoga.
And
I mean,
with Saturn, Mark, with Saturn, fifth house, so fifth, ninth house from Dasha Lagna.
right. So they would form a 5-9 combination from that perspective, which would be what's called a Trikona Raja Yoga from a Dasha Lagna point of view. And, you know, I would say that that is a part of the story. It's not the first thing I would make note of, however. However, it is, you know, certain, and
It's the-
particularly why this Venus-Saturn period, that's definitely part of the story. But what, you know, what else is present here?
Venus also participates in the Lagnadi yoga, the Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury in the 6th, 7th, 8th from the Lagna.
Good. So Sandeep recognizes that with all natural benefics falling 6th, 7th, and 8th from the moon, this gives a Lagnayati yoga, which is quite a substantial yoga and can contribute to it giving this kind of effect. But we're missing something here. When we see
Debilitated graha aspecting a lagna is a Raja Yoga.
Especially even a Greek lord.
Debilitated graha Venus aspecting a lagna is a Raja Yoga.
Well, it may be so. That's not the way I would think about it, Neelima, but I would consider you to be on the right track. When we see a debilitated planet, what's the first thing we look for?
It is a Nicha Bhanga.
Yes. Does it have any cancellation? What do you see here?
There is
The
cancel.
exchange with Mercury.
Right. So the exchange with Mercury, and you've all heard me mention probably that I consider this one of the most effective forms of cancellation. So this is a Nietzsche planet, but it's Nietzsche Bhanga. And then where does it fall? What house?
7th house
In an angle.
in an
So
angle.
this is the very condition under which a planet can give Nietzsche Bhanga Raja Yoga, right? So 3 things must be present for that to happen.
Especially,
Go ahead.
especially the dasha of Venus and the bhukti of Mercury is what I recall being taught. The debilitated graha dasha and the bhukti of the dispositor.
And I would agree with that. And it was in this period that, you know, he held this position, but the position actually came first in Venus-Saturn. But what the point I want to make here is that this is the condition under which a debilitated planet can give Nietzsche Bhanga Raja Yoga. 1, it must be debilitated. 2, there must be effective cancellation. 3, the planet must fall in an angle or a trine. I've seen the angle position to be more reliable results this way. But then you add to that the Lagna Adi Yoga as well. And this is where you get, this is where it's predictable that this gives such a result. So, but it was in the early 50s that he, you know, was doing this communist witch hunt thing. And this was in the Sun major period, right? And the Sun major period brought about both his continued, but it would have brought about a fall, right? First of all, where is because what happened is that, you know, when it sort of became aware that, you know, a lot of what he was saying, his accusations, they were baseless and so forth, basically he was discredited and he was actually censured by one of the few people ever censured by his colleagues in the Senate. And after that, he just sort of, you know, faded away. He was disgraced. and actually died at a fairly young age, which I'll get to in a minute. But first of all, what is the combination in this chart here that could show the potential for a career fall, substantial career fall? Is there some yoga here that you would see that could contribute to that?
The 10th log of karma is in Dusthana.
And then what additionally is happening to the 10th house?
And the
Duryoga.
10th house, Duryoga, and then the 10th house has malefic, Ketu place, an aspect of Saturn.
So this is Duryoga, right? This is Duryoga, defined by when the 10th Lord goes to one of the tricks houses, 6, 8, or 12. And then there's additional malefic influence onto the 10th house itself, which happens with Rahu Ketu here and Saturn. Jupiter does aspect onto its own 10th house. He wasn't removed from his position. He was just sort of disgraced and kind of shuffled off to the side. The process of this happening was Sun, Jupiter, followed by Sun, Saturn. Now, why would the Sun potentially be giving this kind of effect in the Jupiter subperiod? Does anybody see any factor that could contribute to that? Some principle that I tend to overuse or over talk about. Here's a hint. Whose nakshatra is the Sun in?
Jupiter.
Jupiter's nakshatra. You've all heard me talk about this thing I refer to as Udu's clue, where when you see the nakshatra lord of a major period lord, it can give you some clue as to some other sort of events that can happen in that period. So it being in Jupiter's nakshatra, it actually activates the Duryoga, and actually did so in the Jupiter subperiod. But now come to Sun Venus. Why would I be talking about Sun Venus in the context of this lesson?
Venus is in the nakshatra of Moon, and Moon is in the 5th house, but it is the 8th house from the 10th house.
Well,
So
all what you said is true, but it's actually much simpler and straightforward than that. Sun Venus.
Venus is the 8th lord. Aspecting the Lagna, Saturn is already there. There is a formation of a Arishta-like situation. And Sun is the 6th lord in the 8th house, debilitated, afflicted by Mars. So 6th and 8th, and the Lagna gets involved.
And Sandeep, all that is well seen and well articulated, but
Venus is Venus.
come
I'm
back.
sorry, Mark. Venus
Go
is
ahead.
in the 7th Maraka house. It's a benefic in a Maraka house.
And what is the Sun?
The Sun is
Which
6th
house?
lord
Yes,
and 6th lord in the 8th.
right. So
And
again,
it is with Mars as the 2nd Maraka Lord as well.
right. Now remember what the article was mostly about. It was about the major period, for example, of a trick house lord, in this case, the Sun ruling the 6th, and the subperiod of a primary mark, in this case, Venus in the 7th, both with affliction of natural malefics, right? Sun is with Mars, Venus is aspected by Saturn. This is exactly the kind of period that I was writing about. He died during this period at a fairly young age, as you can see. He had gotten, he'd become very alcoholic, as I recall, and I think he may have died with some complications with regards to cirrhosis of the liver. But this is exactly the kind of period that I was referring to that can bring this kind of result. But I wanted to discuss the chart in other contexts because there are some good, Jyotish principles, learning points here. Okay.
Also, Mark, with an additional point, Mercury has to be considered a malefic here because it's 7th Maraka Lord with the Sun as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mercury here is the 7th Lord. It's in the 8th. It's with the Sun. It's with another primary mark of Mars. So you can see the very obvious danger to the life in the Sun major period in general, and then come to that. And I think it might have been you, Peter, said something about benefics in the 7th house. He may be recalling something I think I probably mentioned in the article in the Lagu Parashri. It mentions that natural benefics in the seventh become the word that is used as the surest killer. And, you know, and again, in the right context, and when the person's ayus is up, I found that to be quite true, and this would be another example of that. Okay,
Mark, I have a question.
yes.
Here, can you apply the great parashara exception here? Because in the eighth house, there is a debilitated lord, and Lagna lord is not getting aspected, but the Venus is aspecting the Lagna. Do you consider this?
No, I don't. I would not see this as being
Okay.
the case with the great pressure. But you know, as the sixth lord in the eighth, there is this harsha yoga with additional malefic influence. There is this form of viparit raja yoga. And you know, and he did throughout this sun period, actually, this is when he had his greatest, you might say, fame in terms of, you know, everybody recognized the name of Joe McCarthy because of these, you know, judiciary hearing meetings that he was holding with regards to the communist scare. And but you know, obviously it also brought his downfall and death for the reasons that we've talked about. But no, I don't know that I would see this as being an example of the great pressure acceptance, but I can't say for sure. You know, just before we leave this, you know, I have found that predicting career rise or predicting, you know, position based on the concept of Nichabanga Raja Yoga, it can be a little tricky. I mean, there's so many examples that I could show, and I wrote an article about this where the concept just works perfectly as it does here. But, you know, many of you are all aware that I wouldn't make a prediction unless I was seeing confluence in the Jyotish system. So I want just before we leave the discussion of this chart, you can see in 1951 in Virgo, right? I mean, in Charadasha, starting at age 43, you know, remember that in the Vimshotri system, he entered Venus Saturn at age 44. So in other words, wait a second, that's not right. 51, 44, I'm not sure what's going on here. But you can see Virgo.
Yeah, 43, he starts the Sun Dasha, just at the start of the Sun Dasha.
Sun Dasha, yeah, no, thank you.
So
And
the
so-
Parashara exception does kind of show up in that sense.
Well, or Viparit Raja Yoga, with, you know, Sun as the sixth lord in the eighth with malefic influence at Harsha Yoga from Paladipika. But the point I wanted to make is that simultaneously, you know, coinciding with this period where he had all this, you know, high public profile, coincided with Virgo as a major period in Charadasha. And what strikes you about that?
Virgo contains the Atmaraka Mayakarak Venus, forming a Raja Yoga with the PK Saturn.
Right. So basically, it's a sign containing the AMK. You've already, you know, all of you who studied Jyotish with me or studied K and Ross books know that this is a period that can give career rise, especially if it has some source of strength, the way we've talked about the exchange here. And then if it's additionally formed in some Jyotish Raja Yoga, which it is with the PK Saturn. And but one other thing I want to highlight about it that I've been emphasizing when I've discussed Jyotish as of late, when you're running the sign period of Virgo, some sign like Virgo, you want to see not just planets in it and influencing it, but also who the Karaka is. So what, you know, Mercury rules Virgo, and you can see it's with the G, it's the GK, right? So when he runs this period, my point is that it activates not just, you know, the AMK and the PK Jyotish Raja Yoga, but it activates the GK and the combinations that it forms. Now, many of you may recognize that the AK with the GK, with the naturalific Mars, who also plays the role of the DK, right, which is the Marika in that system, is in a Jyotish Arishta Yoga. And again, he died, he passed away in this Virgo major period. So you want you to understand how Virgo gives that result. It's because, you know, it's activating this Jyotish Arishta Yoga involving the Lord Mercury as the GK. Is that clear to people? Do you understand what I'm saying? Any question about that?
Mark, I have one question. When we look at Mercury, the Lord of Virgo here as GK, Would Mercury also be acting? Would the position of Mercury in Libra, the second from Virgo, would that act as a Maraka?
Oh,
As well?
you mean does a sign falling second from a major period lord in Charadasha, can it play the role of Mark? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, basically.
It can, in my experience. That wasn't the sub period in which he passed away, but it can, if that's my answer to the question. You know, going back to him, you know, falling ill and dying in his Sun Venus period, one thing that I was highlighting in the article also is when you have like this, the major period of a trick house lord afflicted and the sub period of a primary marka afflicted, you also want to see the positional relationship between them, which is what in this case?
112.
Right, 112. Venus falls 12th is the point. Venus falls 12th from there. Okay, so I'm going to move on here and pull up a chart, and I'm not going to discuss this at any great length like I did this one, but you've all seen many times the chart of John F. Kennedy, because I've used it to illustrate any number of learning points with regards to Jyotish, but you may all remember that he was assassinated in November of 1963 in his Jupiter, Saturn period and sub-period. What strikes you about that?
Jupiter's a Maraka 7th lord and Saturn rules the 6th.
That's it. So what's interesting in this case is that Jupiter, the major period lord, does not, unless I'm missing something here. Well, I mean, I take it back. What would you consider about any kind of affliction to the planets in the 9th house, including Jupiter? What would you consider as being a potential affliction, or not potential? Actually, it would be an affliction to those planets in the 9th.
Malefic.
Papa Kartari.
Yeah, it's malefic having Ketu on one side, Mars and Mercury on the other. Mercury now counts as a malefic because it's with a malefic. And then Saturn, sub-period, right? Where's the affliction there?
Mars.
Mars and Mercury and Lagna.
Well, aspect of Mars. Saturn, so the affliction to Saturn comes from Mars as a natural malefic, but also as a bad planet for this Lagna, the 8th lord. And of course, a sub-period like Saturn also activates the primary Arishta yogas in his chart, right? The one, you know, the Lagna lord in the 8th with the 8th lord aspected by Saturn as the 6th lord with Saturn also aspecting the Lagna. So it was in his Jupiter set period and sub-period, obviously the Ayus was up and, you know, he died by having, being assassinated. Two bullets to the head, terrible.
How does Jupiter Saturn show assassination mark?
Well, where's the combination in his chart that can give assassination? What's the house? What's the house of assassination?
8th house.
8th house.
Yeah,
and the way it's the way in which the Arishta yoga involving the 8th house, involving Saturn, you see Saturn aspects onto Mars, Mercury in the 8th, is the way in which I would say that could be seen.
Thank you.
Sure.
And Jupiter debilitates in the D9.
Jupiter's debilitated in D9. You know, of course, you always look to see if there's any factor for cancellation.
Mark, would we also kind of say that, I mean, is there any role of Kendra Adhipatya Dosha to Jupiter because it owns 2 trines?
Well, the answer the answer is yes. You have to be careful with that principle. Some people erroneously take that to mean that all of a sudden, you know, Jupiter becomes malefic for the Lagna. That's really not the case. It's, you know, the point is that it loses some of its beneficence. This is the way K. and Rao talked about it, right? In the same way that, you know, malefic ruling angles lose some of their maleficness. It doesn't, but what it is very much is a primary marka.
And so maybe, which is why, despite aspecting the lagna, it does not protect, like you say, for retrograde.
Well,
Kendra kind of working.
I think just aspect of Jupiter did protect him. Some of you may have heard talk about, Kennedy had lifelong health problems. 3 times he was so serious that, Catholic priests were brought in to deliver the last rites because they thought he was going to die. Other than the fact that he has a Vargotama ascendant and it gets this aspect of Jupiter not retrograde, I would see this as actually being, I would say it didn't, protect him in this case. It played the role of Marika, but overall, in terms of just his life experience, I would see this aspect of Jupiter onto Lagna somewhat protective. We could debate this. I'm not stating it emphatically, but it's really just the role here of what I've been talking about, which is the major period of Marika's 7th Lord Jupiter, hemmed by malefics, and the sub-period of 6th Lord Saturn, Mula Dracona Lord, with the aspect of Mars. So it becomes, again, just a classic illustration of these types of periods, sub-periods that I was talking about. I want to
Mark?
go on. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mhm.
From the moon, Jupiter is the 8th lord afflicted, and Saturn is the 7th lord in the 12th.
It is.
So, yeah.
So from Chandra Lagna, this looks like a very dangerous period as well. And, in Jaradasha, you talked about, where does it show his assassination? That was from the Vishotra point of view, but it's so clear in the Jyotish point of view. It was the major period of Aries, which the irony is that that period made him president because it's got the combination, the Jyotish Raja Yoga combination of AMK, AK. But it is the 8th house of the horoscope, right? And AK, of course, would also, the irony of this combination is also the AK in the 8th house afflicted by the 8th Lord Mars. You have to see both sides of that. And then the sub-period was Scorpio. Where does this combination fall from Scorpio?
6.
6th house.
6. So it's very clear in the Jyotish system, as it oftentimes is.
Can I please make a point, Mark?
Sure, of course, Dhruv, always.
Mark, it just came to my notice that Mercury is in 8th and it falls in Kritika Nakshatra. So I think he was shot dead. So maybe weapons and all came into play over here.
Good. So
I mean, trying to apply what I've been learning.
And I love that, Drew. Good point. Good point. All right. So we're going to move on here. And actually, what I'm going to bring up is the chart of the current U.S. president, Joe Biden. And I don't want to get into any sort of political views here, but I do want to discuss his chart in the light of this article. So where's the primary Arishta in Biden's chart? I mean, there's different things going on here in regards, but where's the primary Arishta yoga?
Lagna Lord is in the 12th and Moon is in the 6th house.
The Lagna Lord goes to the 12th. Is there a little more to the story than that, Neelima?
Saturn retrograde aspect this house and this Lagna Lord.
With the Lagna Lord is with the 8th Lord also.
Thank you. And then what's going on between the 1st and the 12th Lords?
There is an exchange between Mars and Venus.
Right. So there's a 1-2 exchange, while at the same time the Lagna Lord is with the 8th Lord Mercury, and there's additional malefic influence onto the Lagna, right? With Saturn's aspect there. And Venus here becomes what? Primary mark as the 7th Lord, right? Now, there's different things going on here. Now, this Jupiter is retrograde, but it's also quite strong, very strong, being both Vargotama and Vargotama exalted. And I don't know how many people are aware, But back in the early part of 1988, towards the end of his Mars period, this Arishta Yoga really activated in the sense that, he had 2 operations, brain surgeries, to repair aneurysms, blood vessels in his brain, and his doctors had only given him a 50% chance of surviving. So you see, how this Arishta did operate, but I suppose you could take the view that the 2 best benefics influencing the Lagna, is some protection, and obviously his Ayus wasn't up, he didn't die. But, coming now, of course, to the current major period of Saturn, which he moved into in September of 2022, the man's, 80 years old. What's obviously going to, what result is the Saturn major period obviously going to give?
Well, the
Yes.
Arishta
The marker results.
The Arishta possibly doesn't show a survival to the age of 100 and beyond 100.
Right. It's more than likely, folks, that in terms of what is average longevity and so forth, sure, some people, live to be, that old, but it's much more likely that this will play the role of the primary marker for at the time that he does pass. And some of you may be aware, particularly if you've studied Dr. Chag's work or taken my medical astrology course, that just from a medical astrology standpoint, any kind of retrograde planet is not viewed as being a favorable thing, and retrograde malefics, when they're a part of an Arishta Yoga, as this Saturn is, are worse that way, right? So he's running the he's running the period of a Saturn primary market in the 7th house. And then what sub-period would you maybe identify, given, again, the theme of this article, that might be particularly dangerous this way, and why?
That's in Venus, I would say, Mark, because Venus is the primary marker in the Lagna.
And I'd agree with you on that. Is there anything happening sooner than that you might also point to?
Mercury,
Why Mercury, Samarpita?
because it's 8th lord in 12th.
So, in other words, this would be the major period of Saturn, a primary marker, falling in the 7th, and the sub-period of a trick house lord, Mercury. In this case, both of them components of a primary Arishta Yoga. Right?
Mark, would we also consider Mercury to be borderline combust?
Yes, but then, also, where does Mercury and where's this combination fall from Saturn?
Yeah, 6-8.
Right. So this obviously is a dangerous period for him. And, he's been running Sagittarius. Now, this period that we're identifying, Saturn Mercury, will start in September 2025. You'll see that he will have, shortly thereafter, moved into Scorpio. From the Cheney point of view, what strikes you about that?
It's the period of the GK.
It contains the GK, and then what else? Someone?
The DK also aspects it.
DK plays the role of Mark in the Cheney system. What else?
The AK falls in the 12th. Yeah.
With the influence of 2 malefics. Mars is with it. Saturn makes a Rashi Drishti.
Rahu also.
Rahu also. Ketu also. All malefic influence, actually. So, as you've all heard me talk about, when a person actually dies is not so much a question of Arishta, it's not so much a question of Maraka, it's a question of Ayus. Person can be, very ill, near death, really, and not necessarily pass unless the Ayus has expired. And I have no reliable ability to calculate Ayus, so I'm making no statements regards to that. But according to the article I wrote, and also applying now the Jyotish system, you can see that, you know, this period for him, it's going to bring a health crisis of some sort. And, you know, fairly understandable. The man's going to be in his early 80s. It's not unusual for that to be the case, particularly someone with his medical history, actually. Now, before I leave this chart, I do want to highlight some other things unrelated to the article. I mean, the fact is that this man currently in his, well, let me back up. He he actually had a remarkable sense of his own destiny. When his first wife, I know you probably all know, she tragically died in a car accident. When he was first dating his future first wife, they were on vacation together during college down in Florida, and he actually told her that his ambition was to become the president of the United States. His first ambition was to become the youngest U.S. senator ever, and he actually achieved that goal because he became a U.S. senator for the first, at the age of 29, which was the youngest for anyone ever to do that. It was actually in his Mars Moon major period. I'm sorry, I take that back. It was in his, I meant to say the moon. It was in the moon major period. And he was 29 at the time. So what is that? Yeah, he had just moved into the moon. So how does the moon give this kind of result? Well, in what way could that be predicted that this would elevate him to such a high political position at such a young age?
Kesari Yoga?
Kesari Yoga is a part of the story. I mean, it's a good Kesari Yoga, right? The moon is coming to fullness. It is Jupiter's falling forth from there, from the Simhamsa seat of power. He got a seat in the Senate during that time. We've already talked about Jupiter's status as being Vargotama exalted. But I want people to see the moon, both in Navamsha. Sorry, did someone want to say something?
Yeah, the Mars and Moon form Raja Yoga 1-9.
Right. So, in fact, it was in Moon Mars that this happened. So you have to see that the moon is also involved in a 1-9 Raja Yoga, and then see this whole combination from Dasha Lagna. Which would be the same thing as Chandra Lagna when he runs the moon period. Think about what combination the moon and Mars become from there. Moon becomes the fourth lord, Mars becomes the first lord, right? Moon Mars gives this result, but I want people to see moon both in Navamsha and Dashamsha, and also Saturn, the current period where he is president, and who knows, may continue to be president after the next election, remains to be seen. What do we notice about, first of all, in Navamsha? Look at this combination here. What strikes you about it involving the moon and Saturn?
Saturn is the Yoga Karaka in the 9th. The moon is the 10th lord. So 9-10.
5-10 Raja Yoga.
And what's the best combination, according to Parashahora, for Libra? Best Raja Yoga combination?
Saturn Mercury.
No.
Moon Mercury.
Moon Mercury.
Moon Mercury.
Moon is just ruling only the 10th, Mercury ruling the good 9th and 12th, impressionable, and then add to that Yoga Karaka Saturn, right? And so this is, without this, the moon period doesn't, make him the youngest senator ever, and I doubt if the Saturn period sees him as being a president. But now see these same planets in D10. What do you notice?
There's an exchange between the moon and Mercury, a 9-10 exchange with the influence of Yoga Karaka Saturn.
Again, it's the same combination, only in a different way. Right? And by the way, the Kesari Yoga continues in the Dashamsha, right? And it was in the Jupiter major period that he first became vice president, and shortly after moving into Jupiter. And of course, this was the period that made him president as well. So, this is where the divisional charts can and should shed so much light additionally on what periods can give. This would be particularly true of this Saturn, because otherwise, from the standpoint of the birth chart, Saturn's what? The third and the fourth lord and the seventh? In a mutual glance with the seventh lord Venus and the 10th lord Sun, there's no real angle trine combination going on there. And, from the moon, actually, it's the 10th lord in the second Marika position again. So this is what I also wanted to highlight now that I've got his chart up here.
Mark, would you also consider Saturn to be the giver of power as the parliament, as Mr. Rao says, 4th house, and Mercury making a Viparita Raj Yoga? So maybe there is something in store which could be interesting.
Well, as the fourth lord, as you know, the Simhamsa, the seat of power and so forth, it's quite relevant that way. And it's a fourth lord aspecting back onto its own fourth house, right? And, the fourth house also represents the throne, right? And so I would go along with that. But my point is that if Saturn isn't doing what it's doing in D9 and D10, right? This Saturn doesn't show much eligibility for having him be in such a high position, is my point.
In fact, after you showed the D10, it prompted me to look at it like that. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to be.
Right, exactly. Okay, so continuing on here, I'm going to bring up the chart of a former, I guess I'm doing politicians today, the former vice president in the George Bush administration, a guy by the name of Dick Cheney. Many people saw him being the real power behind the power, and George Bush Jr. being more of a figurehead. But the reason I'm wanting to talk about this chart is that this man had quite a history of heart disease. He had a number of heart attacks. They call them cardiac incidents these days, and survived them, and eventually got to the point where his heart situation was so bad that the only way he was going to survive is if he had a heart transplant, which he actually did have successfully. And this was actually some time ago, and he, remains alive. So quite a dramatic story that way. What Karaka, what planet, what graha represents the heart?
Sun.
The sun. Where do we see it here? Where does it fall? As the Lagna Lord?
Lagna Lord in the 6th and has the influence of Saturn.
Influence of Saturn. What would be a saving grace here with this
Jupiter.
sun?
Aspect of Jupiter. With Sun.
Shubhakartari.
Yes.
Right. We've got a benefic hemming here, right? Venus on one side, Mercury. Venus on one side, Mercury on the other. It's not, I would call the best benefic hemming, but there is benefic hemming here. And by the way, the time when he had his heart transplant, kind of an amazing demonstration of the Vimshotri Dasha, was, I'd have to go back and check that, but I'm fairly certain it was Sun Saturn when he had this at age 70 back in 2011, and the man's still alive. But he had his first heart attack in the Mercury major period, Jupiter sub-period. In the light of this article, what strikes you about that?
Mercury is a Marika's second lord, and Jupiter is the 8th lord.
Jupiter is an 8th lord, but not just the 8th lord. What else is going on with it?
With Saturn.
With Saturn.
6th lord.
Affliction.
6th lord.
Affliction, right? And then Mercury is a Marika twice over, right?
Yeah.
A
Second lord.
Marika twice, and then does it have any affliction?
Mars.
Aspect of Mars. So at age 37, he had his first heart attack. I have a note here. Wait a second. It was actually Mercury, Jupiter, Mars. Look at that. Mercury, Jupiter, Mars. So again, sort of just a demonstration of what I've been talking about here. Not really going to say anything more about this. And then coming to this horoscope. Anybody recognize the name Hank Aaron?
Yeah, this great slugger.
Right. So very famous baseball player, known in particular for breaking Babe Ruth records for the most career home runs. Hammer and Hank, he was referred to, quite the batsman. You know, held other records as well. So he lived to a pretty ripe old age, as I recall. What's my note here? So you can see he lived into his mid 80s, but you can see that in 1975, he moved into his Venus major period, which of course has what status in this horoscope?
Second Lord, Mark.
It's the second mark of Lord. Does it have any affliction?
Saturn, Rahu.
Is with Saturn and Rahu. And take a guess
And
as to
combust.
Yes, it has some combustion, right?
By the top.
And then anybody want to hazard a guess at what sub-period he passed within the Venus major period?
Is Saturn?
Mars.
Jupiter.
Who said Jupiter?
Jupiter, I would say Jupiter, seventh
the-
Lord.
Seventh Lord placed where?
Second house.
In the second Marakasthana.
Right.
And it's a benefic.
Right. So the other periods and sub-periods that I was highlighting in the article, people may recall, is periods and sub-periods of primary marakas. So Venus here is the second Lord, primary maraka with affliction. Jupiter here is the in the second house. Not really
By Saturn.
aspected by Saturn. You know, so again, thank you. I was missing that at first, but I knew there was a reason I picked this example because again, it's exactly what I'm talking about in the article. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent here to make a point about, again, the importance of interpreting periods from Chandra Lagna. So his first great success as a baseball player, and it was really a very high level of success, happened in his Jupiter major period. So again, what is he being successful at? He's being successful as an athlete, professionally playing a competitive sport. So, what combination does Jupiter have here that could indicate for just by itself that this could be a period that could give him a status? And what's Jupiter's source of strength here?
Kesari.
It's Kesari Yoga, right? And then Jupiter's source of strength?
Vargotama.
Vargotama. But then how does this show him being successful, playing competitive sports?
From the moon, Jupiter is the lord of the third and the sixth.
That's it exactly, Angus. How else do you predict that?
Mark, Jupiter is in the nakshatra of Mars, which is conjunct the 10th Lord in the 6th house.
Right. And
which
so
is the third Lord also.
And that adds additional color, doesn't it? So it could be maybe predicted
aspects, Mars, Mercury.
Through the idea of Udu's clue, right? But otherwise, you see here, just that. I don't want to go any farther with this. This is not the main import of this.
One more point, Mark, I want
Sure.
to make is that Jupiter is in very early degrees of Libra, which will place it in Libra in many divisional charts. So that makes Jupiter very strong in terms of giving it results powerfully.
Extremely strong. Just like, this is the same degree of Bill Clinton, former President Clinton's Jupiter, and who became president in his Jupiter major period. And now I told you probably the defining moment in his life was when he broke this long-standing record of having the most career home runs. And it was later in his, he played to a fairly old age. This happened in his Saturn major period. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what sub-period within Saturn? And again, in what way would this be, why would this give such a result here? First of all, what's Saturn's ability here to give, just give Raja Yoga effects?
The Trikona Raja Yoga, Saturn, Venus.
Yes, that's part of the story. It's Saturn, Venus. Always remember that, the two triangulars 5 and 9, either conjunct or in a mutual glance or an exchange, becomes what's called a Trikona Raja Yoga in Parashara. That's an effect though, but do we see this in a different way as well?
Well, from Dasha Wagner, Saturn Venus is the Dasha Wagner word plus the Yoga Karaka. So
Yeah.
That too, but now see it from the moon.
it's the opposite now.
Right. Venus becomes the first lord, Saturn becomes the Yoga Karaka, 4th and 5th lord. So when you see confluence in terms of a combination, in this case, Saturn and Venus, giving, such yoga from all three perspectives, then it becomes, a rather dramatic picture. Saturn, of course, here strong in its own sign. And it was exactly in Saturn major period, Venus sub-period, that he hit the home run that broke the record. And it was a huge moment in sports history and baseball that was giving, huge publicity. Okay, so one more celebrity horoscope before, or famous people's horoscopes before I start looking at, other charts. Anybody a country western music fan here? Where is this? Oh, I may not have this horoscope here. Must be in another database. All right, let me get rid of this. The information here. Sometimes we see things in the horoscopes of friends that we don't want to see. I'm going to pull up the chart of a person that's been a lifelong friend. We met when he was 19. I think I was 22. We were both studying with a guru at that time, Goswami Kriyananda. He actually was the first person to move out to the San Diego area. I came out later. We take walks together once a week. We've been just very good friends for a long time. And of course, I have my eye on his horoscope. Let me concentrate here and get this chart up. No wonder I can't find it. I'm in the wrong database. Here it is. All right. So if you look down at the current period and sub-period, you can see starting in January 2021, he moved into Venus Saturn. So, Venus Saturn actually holds a lot of quite good potentials in certain ways. But in the light of what we're talking about here, what would you have to notice about it also?
Both planets are primary markers.
Yes, but also, Venus, of course, as the second lord's a primary marker, does it have any affliction?
Yes, it's afflicted by Mars.
And
by Saturn as well.
And
Ketu Rahu.
a Rahu Ketu axis, right? So it's got all malefic influence with Mars, who happens to be the 8th lord. So not a good Mars. And then, what kind of condition is this Mars in? That's not good at all.
Gandhar.
What else?
Rahu Ketu again, Saturn
Well,
aspect.
that's an affliction, not a, what's
Debilitated.
it's an debilitation sign, and it's a Gandanta, and it's afflicting this Venus, as is the aspect of Saturn, and then also influence of Rahu Ketu axis. So, and then Venus is a primary mark as the second lord, and Saturn is a primary mark falling in the second house, but then also which house does Saturn rule besides the fifth here?
Six.
The sixth.
And it gets aspect of Mars.
And it gets the aspect of Mars. So it was pretty clear to me that this could be a dangerous period that could precipitate a health crisis, and this proved to be all too true when he was diagnosed in Venus, Saturn, Rahu. Think about that. Venus, Saturn, Rahu, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Now, the good news is that it was fairly early detection. It was what's called stage 2 prostate cancer, which is quite treatable. And he underwent treatment. It involves some use of some drugs, but then also radiation to the point of the cancer. And he's gone through the treatment, and it remains to be seen what the outcome is, but it should be okay. Right? But no question, it was certainly the most significant health crisis in his life. Right? So just again, a demonstration of two things. It's the period and subperiod of 2 Markas with affliction, but it's also the period of a major period of a Marka, and then also the subperiod of a trick house lord, in this case, the 6th. Any questions about this particular example before I move on?
From Dasha Lagna Venus, Saturn is primary Marka, and Rahu is also in the 7th.
It is good observation.
Quick question mark here. Because Saturn and Mars are like in a 410, it's like, and how has it played out? Because in his Venus Dasha, or in general in his life, and they're like Mars is 8th lord and Saturn is 6th lord.
Yeah, you see Venus here being the lord of the 9th, right? And it's under the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis. So he never knew his biological father. His mother had married his father, but soon after he was born, they divorced, and she basically cut the biological father out of his life. He had a stepfather, right? You see, K.N. Rao used to always talk about the Rahu Ketu axis being the axis of unorthodoxy. There's some sort of unusual or abnormal situation, whatever sort of it influences. And, just to give you an example of how sometimes some of the statements in the Sanskrit text can be so accurate, I remember when I was reading Paladipika once, it talked about when the 9th lord is in the movable Rashi, aspected by Saturn, the person will be adopted. And you can see how this is exactly the case. His 9th lord Venus is in the movable Rashi Cancer, aspected by Saturn. And so that has played itself out. Ironically, there's some Danyogas here, no? Venus is the 9th lord in the 11th.
Yeah.
It gets aspected by a Vargotama, an exalted 5th lord Saturn. Right? And on that, one of my predictions in this chart was that in the K2 Saturn period and subperiod, it would prove very exceptional in terms of his income. And, he had his own sort of individual consulting practice, executive coaching, team building consulting practice, and his business brought in $500,000 during that year. So you see the activation of the Dan Yogas, and he is financially independent. He's retired now, but very well off financially, done well with investments and so on. So there's the other side of these Dan Yoga combinations that Venus is involved in. But now I want to come back to one more thing. Remember the danger of the Venus Saturn period and subperiod? We've discussed all the reasons why, but then whose nakshatra is Venus in?
Saturn.
Saturn's nakshatra. So you see that principle playing itself out, right?
From the moon, again, Venus is in second house, Saturn is eighth lord, Rahu is in the eighth, and all planets are afflicted by Mars.
Yep, you see it. It was pretty obvious that this period could bring some danger this way, unfortunately. But it seems like he's come through it.
Last few charts, Mark, I've observed is there's some combination of sixth and eighth lord, either aspect or they're together.
Yep. All too reliable that way. So after I put out the article, someone who is a part of the article subscription program volunteered their chart as being an example that could be used in the webinar, so I appreciate that. And they were highlighting and specifically their Saturn Ketu period and sub-period. Why would they be highlighting that period and sub-period? Saturn major period, Ketu sub-period, which, by the way, they ran starting October 2020 up to 11/2021, so just recent history. So they would have done this at age early 40s. So which houses does Saturn rule for this Lagna?
8th and 9th.
So the good 9th, but also the 8th. So major period of a trick house lord doesn't have any affliction.
Rahu Ketu axis.
Rahu Ketu axis. Whose results does Ketu give primarily, first and foremost?
Saturn.
Well, who's it with? I always start with the planet it's conjunct.
Second lord.
Second lord.
Second lord moon. So in this way, this is the major period of a trick house lord, Saturn with affliction, and the sub-period of a planet that gets afflicted, but who gives the results of a Maraka second lord moon. And like so many people in the world at that time, if you look at the time frame that this happened, he got COVID, but COVID apparently triggered some autoimmune disease, and also he had a displaced spine. He reports he had a displaced spine during this period. And then in the earlier period of, he's a sportsman, plays tennis, and he mentioned that in Saturn Ketu, now this is the same sort of dasha sequence, just Ketu on the third level. He ruptured his Achilles tendon and had to have a surgical operation in order to repair it, playing tennis. You see this combination here in the third lord of sports. But it's all, in what way would it also be activating some more primary sort of Arishta Yoga type thing going on here? Not severe, but it's there. You know, we always look at a planet's dispositor, right? When you're running a major period lord like Saturn. So who's its sign lord?
Sun.
Where does it go? Where does it go?
Sixth house.
Who's it with?
With Mercury Lagna Lord.
In the sixth, right? So he had a sports injury. He had a sports injury during this time, right? So I appreciate his willingness to share this example. And
also, Mark, I think Ketu is in Purva Bhadrapada in Sandhi, which is the front end of a funeral court. So kind of not so conducive as a nakshatra for Ketu.
yeah, and you know, Aquarius as a zodiacal segment rules sort of like the part of the anatomy that's more like, you know, the Achilles tendon is connecting the ankle with the foot, right?
Yep.
So, you know,
And it's in Jupiter's nakshatra, which is seventh lord in the second, retrograde, under aspect of Mars.
That's a good observation. Okay.
I want to make a point, Mark.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mark, I noticed that there is a Arishta Yoga over here, like from a static point of view, like Lagna Lord goes to the sixth house and sixth house aspect Lagna. Though we have Jupiter's aspect on the Lagna Lord here, but it's kind of a retrograde. So I was just a point, and from a Gemini point of view, also like the AK is there in the sixth house, though it's not additionally afflicted by malefics, but it's not a very good placement.
Right. So as I said, when you run Saturn, indirectly it activates the primary Rishta because it's, a part of this combination of Mercury as the Lagna Lord in the sixth, while there's additional malefic influence on the Lagna. In this case, Mars, not a good planet for this Lagna, rules the sixth, right? So, I don't think this man mentioned that until he ran Saturn, he really hadn't experienced much or any physical health problems but now that he's moved into Saturn, that has come. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight the time when he had the rupture of his Achilles tendon, had to have it surgically repaired, because you can see this is operating not as a period and subperiod, but as a period, subperiod, and sub-subperiod combination. And I want to show another example of that, because this is something to make note of as well. Come on here. Where is this? So we talked about Trishadai lords, operating with a primary Maraka lord, and or the period and subperiod of two Marakas, right? So if you look down at the Dasha sequence, you can see that this person entered their Saturn major period back in 2018, right? So why does it, what qualifications does Saturn have here to bring health problems?
Second Lord in the 11th house, exalted and retrograde.
Right. First of all, it's a mark of second Lord. And second Lord, and secondly, it has affliction aspect of Mars, right? So it's an afflicted Maraka. Yes, it's in its exaltation sign. But what might it be its significance falling in the 11th? Why, I think you all know this, but I'll just ask the question, why can planets in the 11th cause health problems?
6 from the 6.
Because Bhavat Bhavam 6 from the 6th.
And it is in exchange with the Venus, Lord of the 6th and the 11th.
Correct. It's in this exchange. And then whose nakshatra is it in?
Jupiter.
Jupiter's nakshatra. And then what sub-period, therefore, and why, or sub-sub-period, could be dangerous?
Saturn moon.
I wouldn't dispute that, but it's not the one I was thinking of.
Jupiter and Venus?
Yes, Jupiter.
Saturn, Jupiter.
Jupiter, Saturn, Jupiter. She had a mild stroke during this time that did cause some impairment, both physically and cognitively, that fortunately it was mild and she did recover. But of course, this person was going to run their Saturn period until 1981. I mean, until the age 81, 2037, and the period that it could be quite dangerous, and maybe if her longevity was up, could bring the end of her life. Could be, of course, Saturn, Jupiter. So again, just sort of the illustration of the kind of periods and subperiods that I was talking about. All right. Well, let me bring up this chart now. So at the end, toward the end of the article, I talked about planets that are ruling Trishadies, 3, 6, 11, running a major period of such a planet, and then it's supposed to be with affliction, and then sub-period of a primary mark, or the reverse, major period of a primary mark, a sub-period of a Trishadie Lord. So you can see, if you look at the current period and sub-period here, they're running Saturn-Venus. So what strikes you about that?
Venus is in the sign of Saturn. Venus is the 7th Lord. Marika Lord.
Well, start with Saturn here, right?
Okay.
So Saturn is a 3rd Lord, Trishadie
3rd
Lord,
Lord. 8th house.
placed in the 8th, and with some affliction, right? Rahu
Rahu
Ketu
Ketu.
axis, you can see very close in degrees. And then the sub-period of Venus, of course, is a primary 7th Lord. Now, fortunately, unless I'm missing something, there really isn't any affliction, right? And there is some benefic influence additionally. And, this person has, in this period and sub-period, had a little bad episode that affected her health. Nothing, long-lasting or nothing really permanent, but you can sort of see the potential of this. This is, I've told this person and their student that they really needed to take measures to guard and protect their health during this time. And of course, I'm recommending a particular practice aimed at helping that, or providing that protection. But why additionally would this particular Saturn-Venus period and sub-period, have some potential this way, aside from the things that was already been said?
Venus is in the 8th from the Saturn.
6, 8.
Right. It's the where it falls, right? From positionally. This is something that we always see as well. Saturn falls. Venus, the sub-period Lord, falls in the 8th from there. One thing I want to highlight, though, I did an article on all the trick house lords, and I gave the exhaustive meanings of those houses given from that Sanskrit classic, Uttara Kamarita. And one of the lesser known, or maybe lesser referred to, meanings of the 8th house is, wilderness areas, uninhabited areas, remote areas, these kind of areas. And it's interesting to know that in this person's Saturn major period, first of all, they have a great love of travel and going to places and taking pictures. And where they tend to go is these really distant, out of way, uninhabited type of places. And this person actually, maybe currently and as recently, been on a cruise to the North Pole, for example. And they love to go to wilderness areas, like on safari, and photograph animals, and especially in Africa and India, in their natural habitat. If you use Dasha Lagna, what would support the idea this person would be doing a lot of long distance travel, and actually predicted this in a particular period and sub-period. Use Dasha Lagna. What's going on here that could really indicate something like that?
1-9 exchange. Saturn.
Right. Good, Jay. You see that from Gemini, there's an exchange between Mercury and Saturn, and that exchange becomes 1-9. Whenever you see an exchange in a chart and a person runs a particular major period like this one, Saturn, you really want to see what kind of exchange that becomes. It becomes actually, as you can see, quite a favorable exchange from this perspective. So this is what I had to share with you today. I'm going to be writing an article about a happier topic next time. Right? But of course, these types of experiences people have are part of life, unfortunately. So being able to see these astrologically is useful. It applies to my own chart, as I showed you in the article here. Fortunately, nothing too toward has happened this way. Anyway, any final thoughts or questions before we conclude for today?
I have a quick question, Mark. The chart you were showing of the sportsman with Moon and Ketu afflicted Saturn more. So I know a similar chart where Moon and Ketu for that particular native, same Lagna, but it's in the 5th house. It so happened that when the father was running the Ketu Moon period, the child was impacted, because that affliction happened in the 5th.
I see. Yeah. Right. Well, this is how, when we have experience, right? We've seen a number of things in a chart, right? And we've known what they've meant in previously, then, it kind of informs us about maybe some other chart that we're looking at. Again, any additional thoughts and questions before we conclude?
Yes,
with
Mark?
Yeah.
If you see a primary marker that is debilitated, would you say that weakens it or just makes it worse?
Oh, you mean weakens its ability to give mark effects?
Yes.
No, no, I would say that, well, affliction has so much to do with it, as we've seen in these examples, Peter, right? So, if I'm seeing like in the Joe McCarthy's chart, where he's got that Venus there sitting in the 7th house, primary marker house, it is instabilization sign, but there's cancellation, but it gets that aspect from Saturn, right? This to me is the factor that turns things in a real dangerous direction. Right? We always must remember, and I'm sure all you know this, but what's the most primary yoga in Jyotish? Shubha, Ashubha, right? Does something have the influence of a natural benefic, or does something have the influence of a natural malefic? And this, Jyotish is infinitely complex. We all know that. It's a vast ocean we all drown in. But certain things are just very, very simple. Right? If you see some house and it's got only malefic influence and no benefic influence, and the Lord is bad place, that it has only malefic influence and no benefic influence, you can rest assured that the indications of that house are not going to flourish in a person's life. And quite the opposite. If some house and house Lord only get benefic influence, and the house Lord is well placed, and there's no additional malefic influence, that house and all the indications of that house are going to flourish. Now, it's rare to see such houses. It's usually some sort of mixed condition, right? And then you have to decide, is it like 50-50, 80-20, and what dashas are running and what's going to be activated when, But, and we always must keep in mind, Peter, and I think you know this, with debilitated planets, they can have Nichabanga, but their natural significations are still going to be harmed. And the indications of the houses that they rule are still going to be harmed, right? Now, it may give Nichabanga Raja Yoga, but the other is going to be true as well, right? It's a good thought.
Mark, can
else?
I ask one question?
Always, Neelima, your questions are always good.
Well, thank you. Between the 7th and the 2nd house, which is worse of a maraka?
Well, what does it say in Prashahura? Second.
Second, yes.
Right. Planets in or ruling the 2nd house have the greatest ability, most powerful ability to bring that result. Afterwards, planets in or ruling the 7th. But as you know, if you read my article, Lord Yama pays a visit, there's a whole hierarchy, right, of planets that become, this is the Mochaldro, and then after that it's this one, and then after that it's this one. What's after planets in or ruling the 2nd and 7th house? What's the one that Prashahura identifies as being the most potent this way? Anybody remember? You get extra credit if you get this right. Benefics ruling the 12th. Benefics ruling, but then it goes on. And we must always remember, as I point out in this article, any planet that is listed as a functional malefic for any lagna, right, is going to be able to play the role of maraka. And you'll see that it does. So, in fact, when you examine this thing, almost any planet can play the role of maraka. It's just that some are much more likely to do that than others. And then, as I was pointing out at the end of the article, Saturn and Rahu, they're unqualified markas. They can just give this result because they're Saturn and Rahu, right? Particularly when operating as a period and sub-period Lord together. Anything else?
Mark, I have two questions that are not related to today's subject, though. So they're on a positive note. So let's say I look at a chart from Karakamsha Wagner and I reach a conclusion that it's okay, good disposition. And then I look at the chart from Swamsha Wagner and I reach the conclusion it's very strong. So it's way better. So shall I bias my view on the Swamsha or shall I stick to Karakamsha? That's my first question.
Yeah. So,
And the second question is, I recently listened to a lecture from Ken Rao from early 90s, audio lecture.
Yep.
And he mentioned that Jupiter in Leo is strong, just like Jupiter in Aquarius. Is that true?
if K and Rao says it's true, I'd pay attention to it. I've not come across that myself. You know, the idea of Jupiter being strong in Aquarius comes right out of Brihad Jataka, Varamahira's classic, right? In the chapter on signs, it says, you know, Jupiter in Kumbha, like Jupiter in Karka, meaning, you know, well, Jupiter in Cancer, Jupiter but I've not seen the whole idea of Jupiter in Leo, so I just can't comment on that. I always pay attention to anything Ken Rao says because most everything he ever taught me turned out to be true. Why that would be the case, I'm not sure. Of course, it would be the sign of a great friend, but I just don't know. Now, with regards to your first question, you're talking about fine judgments, right? When we're talking about what indications exist from Karakamsha Lagna versus what indications exist from Swamsha Lagna. As you know, what you're always looking for is some confluence in terms of what certain periods are showing in terms of being able to produce the same kind of result, whatever that result is. But then, you know, what I like to see confluence between, and you know this, is between, say, Parashari system in the Vimshottari Dasha, and then Jaimini in the Chara Dasha. When I'm seeing confluence there, and we saw that in the case of Joe McCarthy's chart, his Venus major period showed, you know, Raja Yoga, and the Sun, anyway, the Virgil major period in Chara showed the same thing. So when you see this sort of thing, this is when you feel confident that you're seeing something that is true. But what your question saying, you know, do you favor one indication over the other? Not really, you know, not really. It's harder when you see a real contrast, right? When one period in, say, a system is showing something and something in another system is showing something quite different, right? That's harder, but there's no easy answer to that, Georgie.
Okay.
Anything else that I can't answer? All right, let's conclude with the Sanskrit prayer then. Om Asatoma Sagamaya Tamasoja Jyotirgamaya Mitrum Utam Gamaya Sarvesham Swasti Bhavatu Sarvesham Shanti Bhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat.